Hi, everybody. I'm Guy Choate. Thanks so much for coming to this webinar with Libby Copeland. I'm thrilled to be here and moderate this session. You may know me. I run the Argenta Reading Series, which I'm out of practice because we canceled back in March because of the coronavirus, and we are waiting to come back until it is safe to do so. But I'm thrilled to have this opportunity. I'm thrilled that the Central Arkansas Library System asked me to moderate this panel. Because it's a fantastic book, a fascinating book, and Libby's a great writer. And we'll get started here in just a second. There we are. Hi, Libby.
Hey, Guy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Of course. Here. Thanks for. Of course. It's a fun thing. You're in New York right now. Like that's correct.
Yeah, I'm in a county north of the city.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to read your introduction and let people know who you are if they're not familiar. Kind of give some background about you and your book. Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire.com, and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March by Abrams Press. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? Fascinating stuff. And just to let everybody know how this is going to go, I'm going to turn it over to Libby and let her read an excerpt from the book, and then we'll have a conversation. I've got some questions prepared for her. And in the last little bit of the webinar, we'll open it up to questions with you guys. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat so that we can plan for those questions moving forward, or wait until the end, however you want to do it. With that, Libby, thanks again for being here, and I'll let you take it away.
Sure, thank you. So this section I'm going to read for the book comes from the prologue to The Lost Family, and it talks a little bit about the people who get really into the project of understanding themselves through family research and through genetic genealogy and DNA testing. So I'm going to read a little bit from the prologue to The Lost Family. I came to think of the community of people I encountered researching this book as seekers. They are people obsessed with figuring out just what is in their genes. Not everyone who orders a direct-to-consumer DNA test qualifies as one, though a lot of folks who enter into this casually find themselves unexpectedly captivated by questions they never thought to ask, questions posed by the DNA itself. At-home DNA testing is sometimes called recreational to distinguish it from genetic tests that are ordered by doctors, but its implications can be far more profound than the term recreational implies. The seekers generally fall into one of three categories. Some started out as avid genealogists. Before they ever ordered a DNA kit, they were already subscribers to the vast stores of genealogical records at ancestry.com. Some had already flown out to the Mormon-run Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah, and spent a week there, camped out up to their ears in old church records on microfilm. For these people, DNA testing through a company like Ancestry or 23andMe was a logical extension of this deep genealogical curiosity. These people try to trace their family trees back hundreds of years, using DNA combined with genealogy to suss out the identity of a particular 19th century ancestor, or to figure out exactly how they're related to a distant cousin. If elderly relatives have difficulty generating enough saliva to spit into a vial, these seekers know that this answer is a slice of lemon. A few, thwarted by the unexpected timing of events, have even resorted to swabbing the insides of their parents' cheeks after death. The second category of seekers is marked by a more immediate and pressing puzzle, brought on, say, by lingering suspicions that the man they called dad might not be their genetic father. Or they might be looking for evidence that they're not related to a family that they never felt at home in. Some find their suspicions validated and others are disabused of them, and some find something else entirely, like a previously unknown half-sibling. Many seekers are adoptees looking for their biological relatives, or those conceived by a sperm donor seeking the stranger who contributed half their genetic material. These seekers join Facebook groups dedicated to the mechanics of what's known as genetic genealogy, learning to talk of haplogroups and centimorgans and triangulation. They sketch countless family trees, trying to figure out where they might fit into them. They call their hobby an addiction. They read tips on how to phrase letters of introduction to their fathers, a topic so fraught and fascinating for what it reveals about the vagaries of human nature and the complications of the human heart that it deserves a dissertation or 3. The third category of people have no inkling that they're about to find out anything surprising, and this is often the most disruptive way in which DNA testing plays out. These people do not start out as seekers. Instead, they test to find out if that old family story of a Native American ancestor is true. They test because they want to know whether they're like that guy in the Ancestry DNA commercial who thought he was one thing and turned out to be another. I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt, he declares, happy in his certainty. They test because they got a kit as a gift for Christmas. And then Easter dinner becomes awkward because the test has revealed something strange. Perhaps a family's understanding of its heritage is muddied by a pie chart offering an ethnicity estimate. And the question, why is it saying I'm half Greek, becomes a curiosity, which becomes a nagging doubt, which becomes a family conversation no one will ever forget. Then these people too become obsessives, trying to solve the mystery, finding possible relatives through Google and Facebook searches, and then offering to buy and ship DNA kits to those people if they'll agree to test. Well, some of them do. Some of them, presumably, back away slowly, like a hiker who spies an old grenade from a long ago war on a beach. These people don't tell their stories. Who could blame them? These people don't have stories. They have DNA results they'd rather not have seen and which they may prefer not to believe. So that's just a little taste of the prologue from the book, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Libby. That's great. So one of the reasons that I think the library asked me to moderate this is that I had my own experience of, I got bit by that genealogy bug, and I think it bordered on addiction there for a few months. And I took the DNA test, and then years after that, someone contacted me and said, hey, I'm adopted, I'm looking for my biological family, and we share DNA. Can you help me? And it was such a feeling that, hey, this doesn't happen to me, like this happens to other people, but your whole book is about people that think that same thing. It happens more often than not. At what point did you realize that you had a book, that you had something that you needed to put together and publish?
Yeah, I wrote about this 3 years ago for the Washington Post, the phenomenon of unexpected DNA results and all the different, I was interested in all the different ways that could play out, right? You know, there's ones that really change your sense of self. There's ones where it's more like, well, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my family, but it turns out not.
Yeah.
There's ones where people's, genetic origins are kind of different than they thought, or their understanding of their ethnicity is different. And then they kind of wrestle with like, what is ethnicity, right? And when I wrote about this 3 years ago, that sounds like not that very long ago, but the databases were so much smaller. I mean, if you look at the database size of the 4 major companies, so the 4 major companies, most of the folks on here probably already know this, but the 4 major companies in sort of descending order of size are Ancestry, which at the moment has 18 million people in its database, 23andMe, which has 12 million, and then MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, which is actually the oldest company, but also the smallest of the major 4. At the time when I wrote this story for the Washington Post, the database size was 8 million, and now it is 35 million. So yeah. I think if I have my math right, that's like 4 times, right? More than 4 times. at the time when I wrote that article, I got like literally hundreds of emails within a very short amount of time from people who had read the Washington Post article. It was like also ran in like the Chicago Tribune and a newspaper in Ireland. And like, so I started getting emails from people like all over the country and all over the world saying like, I've got to tell you what happened to me. And I was so kind of overwhelmed by the flood of stories and all their kind of their variety that I thought like, this is such an important and compelling story. Now that number of people affected is so much larger.
Yeah.
And so I knew I had a book back then because I really wanted to tell some of these very intimate stories, and I wanted to really look at this experience. I wanted to talk about the essential questions that it raises about family, about love, about identity, about ethnicity. But I think like back then, 3 years ago, all that very long time ago, this was still an experience that people were still like, huh. And now that, that happens to people. And now it's like, if it happens to you, there's some support groups you can find. There's some advocacy organizations. There are psychologists who are starting to specialize in this. Like this is very, very normal. And this is very, very common.
Yeah, for sure. You talk about 3 years ago and the database growing, also technology, and how is like legislation affected on this sort of thing? Are you, I'm sure that writing a book and getting it out quickly because it's quickly going out of date. Like how much have you stayed on top of that, and what have you seen since you've written the book that may have changed?
There's some growing sort of state efforts to protect against genetic discrimination. There's growing, and I can talk about what that is. We can get into the nuts and bolts of that. But basically that's, for instance, like an insurance provider, like declining to insure you because they find out the results of a DNA test that may be a recreational DNA test, like a 23andMe test.
Yeah.
There's been increasing use of DNA gathered for genealogical research purposes in solving cold cases. And if you were paying attention to the news this summer, which you could be forgiven for not paying attention to the news, there's a lot going on, and we were all hunkered down. But the Golden State Killer case, was brought to a close, and he was convicted, and that was the first use of this genealogical DNA, so to speak, and that happened in April of 2018. And since that happened, I think the Department of Justice has come out with guidelines for the use of this kind of DNA gathered for family research purposes.
Yeah.
So there have been some things that have happened this year. Ancestry, a big stake of Ancestry was purchased by a private equity firm. This is actually, it's a kind of an important year, in fact, just because it is, you've had all these major things happen. The databases are so big now, and I can talk about why that means something for everyone in the United States, whether or not you ever test. It's also the 20th anniversary of DNA testing for recreational and genealogical purposes in the US. So a lot of big things happening right at this moment. And I feel like this is like a really important moment. And yes, you're right, like constantly kind of changing.
Yeah. I think my impression when I took a DNA test in 2013, I used 23andMe, and I thought that I got the information that it would give me, and then that was that. Like that it was stopped right there. But then after reading your book, I went back to see how 23andMe had used the growing database to be able to further pinpoint my ethnicity. And what had been Northern Europe was now London, because they had enough data. Can you just kind of give an overview for people who may not know how they're able to do that technologically?
Yeah, definitely. So when you take a DNA test, you basically are getting two pieces of information. If you're taking an ancestry DNA test or a 23andMe DNA test, but you're taking it for the purposes of ancestry and genealogy rather than a medical one. So you're getting your list of genetic relatives. So that's everyone in the database who's a close cousin to you. And close cousin is sometimes you get like a third to fifth cousin. or so it'll just say very distant cousin, but that's sort of that's as far out as it's going. And the other thing you're getting is an ethnicity pie chart, which is like a circle, it's like, and little pieces of pie cut out, or it could all be one color. If your entire ethnicity or genetic ancestry 500 to 1,000 years ago is from one spot, and they can tell that, you're just going to be one color. But if you have all four grandparents from a different place, or maybe multiple places, it's going to look chopped up. Now, the reason that your results changed between 2013 and now, and mine too, are not only have changed with constant updates, but I've tested at 3 places and I have various ethnicity estimates at each one, is because each company has its own sort of secret sauce for determining ethnicity. And that means that the results are something to be taken with a grain of salt. And it's important to distinguish between the relative predictions, which are very solid science. They can really tell you that you're closely related to someone, although sometimes they can have trouble determining exactly what the relationship is, but they're actually looking at shared genetic segments. And so with a handful of exceptions, they're really telling you that they can tell a great deal of relatedness if they predict that someone is a close relative. Versus these ethnicity estimates, which are the product of 2 major factors. One is an algorithm. So the kind of the system, the code that the company has set up to interpret the data, which can vary. And the other is the reference population that they've chosen. And if they have 50 people from a particular country like Norway, versus if they have 1,000 people from Norway, they're going to get much better results with the bigger reference population. They're going to be able to get you more granular. They may be able to tell you where exactly in Norway your DNA is from. 23andMe could predict not just that I had a great grandmother from Sweden, but the county that she came from, the county. And, I talked to my dad and I said, it's saying that, your grandmother Sigrid was from Skåne County. He said, yep, that's right. And it blew my mind, right? So they're varying. Now, sometimes, especially the results tend to be better for European Americans. So oftentimes, if you're, say, your ancestors are from Africa or Latin America, you may be getting like sort of broader results. You're not getting a county. You may not even be getting a country. You may be getting like West Africa. And the companies have been trying to improve that, some more than others. But that's sort of where things stand right now. So I interviewed I think every major company. I would talk to their scientific director and I would say, like, why do my results differ here? Why does it say I'm 1% Korean and that has disappeared now and no longer Korean at all? And what they explain is that, DNA can look very similar to other DNA. The particular like letters that they're looking at along your chain of, the chain of DNA, the SNPs. It's not like each one says I am Korean or I am from Spain. They're doing a process of interpretation. They're looking at SNPs in context. They're looking at one SNP on the side of another SNP, and they're trying to make a judgment call. And the algorithm makes many judgment calls, and sometimes it gets it wrong. So if you have results on the margins, like that 1% Korean, some small percentage of Iberian Peninsula, something like that doesn't make sense to you, it could be that that's really there, but it also could be that in 6 months, they're going to do an ethnicity update and that's going to disappear.
Yeah. So you stay on top of it. You check back regularly. That's kind of a fun thing. When I got bitten by the bug, it was kind of like, hey, once I solve this mystery, it's over. But when you add in these scientific elements that are advancing so rapidly, it kind of keeps like it's a living thing that you've got to stay on top of.
Or as you experienced, when the database gets larger and all of a sudden you have a new relative and you have the challenge of figuring out how they're related to you. So it is like this living thing.
Yeah. So everybody that I talk to about the book, they say, yeah, like that's why I don't do it. That's why I don't spit in the vial. But you mentioned that, you've spit in 3 different vials. And so you're not afraid of giving up your information like this?
So in some ways, the decision was made for me because before I ever tested, both my parents had tested and my brother had tested. And my first kit was given to me as a gift from my dad. And what's very interesting, if you look at the history of DNA testing, it starts out 20 years ago, it's a very niche product for people who are deep, deep, deep into genealogical research and have a sort of a scientific bent. A lot of people who are into technology were attracted to it. It's an expensive test. It's a crude test. It doesn't tell you what the DNA test can tell you now, because they're looking at a different kind of DNA. They're looking at Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. It's not telling you the same thing. It's giving you deep ancestry. So basically, you know, at this point, by the time my dad gives me a gift, you know, in late 2016, he gives me a gift for Christmas or Hanukkah. He gives me a 23andMe kit. The industry has really changed, because the previous 2 years, 2016, I should say those 2 years, 2016 and 2017, you see Ancestry DNA, the company is spending $100 million just in advertising each year. Yeah. And it becomes something that was originally for just early adopters, originally just serious hobbyists, to the gift you get for the person in your life who already has everything, which is how it came to me. And so because the results were already in some way like vetted, I mean, to some extent, right? It doesn't mean that we're not going to find a family member we didn't know about and have hopefully like the pleasure of welcoming them in, piecing together like where, and we have had some of those experiences actually. Discovering cousins and like it taking us, it's been actually really amazing and wonderful. But it meant that I knew that I was not going to find out that I was an NPE, right? Yeah. And an NPE, for those who don't know, stands for non-paternity event or not parent expected. And it is probably the most common type of DNA surprise that you can get. And, you know, it's the experience of finding out you're not related to your dad generally, or it could be your mom because you're adopted and turns out you're not adopted, you're not genetically related to either parent. But generally speaking, an NPE, which is also called misattributed parentage, is the experience of discovering that you're not related to your dad. And it is such a common experience at this point because of DNA tests that the Facebook groups that cater to DNA testing and DNA testing experiences are just lousy with people saying, I am an NPE. There's organizations that have come together as advocacy groups for people. There's counselors who are starting to cater to this group of people because it's very important as a mental health area. Like it's extremely important that people be supported because these are often very traumatic discoveries. So I kind of went into it knowing that that wasn't going to be my experience. And I guess, you know, I really respect people if they feel like it's not something they want to do. I feel like that's totally a valid place to be. I went to an event once where Cece Moore was talking. Cece Moore is a genetic genealogist. She's very prominent. She has an ABC show called The Genetic Detective, where she solves cold cases using DNA. And she said, you know, I used to try to help people convince their, you know, elderly relatives to test because they knew, you know, if they could just get that one great aunt to test, it would be the means of figuring out, you know, this one branch of the tree. She said, and people used to come up to me and say, how do I persuade them? And I would help them brainstorm. She said, I don't do that anymore. Because if people have resistance to something, perhaps they know something about their family, or perhaps they just are reluctant to do it. If they find something out and they didn't really go into it in a wholehearted way, she said it's not going to go well for our field. And it's also kind of an ethical thing, right? You don't want to push people. And I have heard people say, well, I don't know what they're going to do with that information. And I've read the consent and privacy policies of the major companies, and I can say I have a pretty good idea of what they've promised not to do with my DNA, but I can't say that 10 years down the line, or 20 years or 30 years down the line, if one of these companies was purchased by another company and the other company had different policies, you know, I can't predict what could happen to my genetic information. That is concerning. And I definitely respect why people might not want to test for that reason.
For sure. I think, I apologize, that's my dog barking at a neighbor. I think that goes really well into a question we've got in the chat from Mark Christ. Does the private equity firm that bought up some Ancestry shares effectively own the DNA information of the people who have taken the test to use, sell as it wishes? Are there any protections for those who spit in the vial?
So the protections in terms of privacy stay the same. So the consent, the privacy and consent documents that exist in terms of who they're sharing your genetic information with remain the same. And so typically major companies will say, like, we're not sharing this information with a third party unless you're consenting to allow us to conduct research on your genetic information, in which case you can change your mind, right? And you can delete your kit. And so all those things kind of stay the same, Ancestry says. The statements that I've seen come out of Blackstone, which is the company that bought a reported 75% share of Ancestry, they've said that they're not going to be directly accessing the information. I don't know. I mean, so I can tell you what they've said, right? Yeah, I can tell you what they've said.
Yeah. Well, let's go to, so my immediate reaction to your book was, I need to get back into genealogy. I need to run my DNA. I need to download my DNA from 23andMe and put it on all these other places and see what I can come up with. But I very quickly got overwhelmed with how exactly to do that, because I'm not a science brain. I'm not a math brain. And it felt like I was in some deep science waters there. How did you navigate that? Do you have a background to understand? Because there's a lot of complexities there that you interpret really well, but it's, there were parts where I'm just hanging on, just trying to keep up with the science. How did you do that?
Yeah. So it was challenging. I've been a reporter for 22 years, and this subject area is really complicated. I've done a good deal of science reporting, I should say. But what I had to do when I was doing the reporting for this, because it was so complex, was I had to talk to a lot of scientists. And when I was done talking to them, I would say, I'm just going to repeat this back, or I'm going to email you what I think you meant.
Yeah.
I had an experience where I toured a DNA testing lab at the oldest DNA testing company in the country, Family Tree DNA. And I recorded it and I took notes, and then I emailed him afterwards and I said, like, you said this machine amplifies the DNA. Do I understand this right? You said this machine, sorts the vials, and you said this machine. So I was kind of like, and what exactly do you mean by that? And then so every conversation I had with a scientist, I would go back and make sure I understood. I had a geneticist read the book. She very kindly read the book for me and basically, helped me see if there were any errors. I had a genetic counselor read certain portions of the book. So I basically had a kind of like like an army of, pro bono scientists, just because they wanted to make sure it was accurate, backing me up, helping me and catching stuff, because I don't have a PhD in genetics. And I know that the limitations of not having that. So it was definitely a heavy lift. After I filed the book, it was May of 2019. I spent the entire summer fact checking it, bit by bit by bit by bit.
Yeah. So you mentioned those genealogists, geneticists. You've got some great characters in the book, real people characters.
Yeah.
How did you latch onto them? Did they email you after they saw your article, or did somebody tip you off to them?
I just reported and found my way to them, so I would say, like, the best kind of industry character, you're talking about the characters from the companies and the sort of scientists, right? The best industry character is a guy named Bennett Greenspan. And he is the guy who founded Family Tree DNA, and he founded it 20 years ago. His company actually sent out its first DNA test kits in April of 2000.
Wow.
And again, it was why DNA testing. So it was going to tell you about, if you were a man, it could tell you about, your father's father's father up the Y chain, so to speak. How he got into this was he was a genealogist, he was doing research, and he had a particular brick wall, and he was really frustrated. And he just decided that he was going to call up a scientist at an Arizona university who he saw had been doing research on the Y chromosome. And the way he knew this guy had been doing this research was he just was reading papers on the Y chromosome. He was reading like papers in scientific journals, and he kept seeing this guy's name at the top. So unlike the vast majority of us, we would just see it and go, I wonder. He called the guy up on a Sunday at his house, and the guy got on the phone.
Wow.
We could hear the guy's wife being like, some guy's calling you. He's a genealogist. And they get on the line, and he's like, hey, my name's Bennett Greenspan. I live in Texas, and I just want to buy a DNA kit from you. And the guy's like, what do you mean buy a DNA kit? Like, this is in the late 90s. Like, we don't sell DNA kits.
Yeah.
And Greenspan was like, oh. And then he said, the scientist said something like, somebody ought to start a business because I get so many crazy, nuts calling me up, asking me this question. And he had a kind of a light bulb moment, and he decided to, like, this was going to be the thing that he was going to do. And he happened to be a serial entrepreneur. So he was like, how about I send you a business plan and we'll do this together? And the scientist was like, okay. And that's actually what happened. And he told me that when he started selling his product, he would go to these genealogy conferences and he would stand in his little cubicle with his product behind him, and he would see people walk past, and he would try to entice them to buy a DNA kit, and nobody could understand the use of it. And so his technique was that he would go up to people and he would talk to them, and then he would not let go of their hand, and slowly walking backwards, holding onto their hand, he would entice them back into the cubicle where his product was in hopes of making a sale.
That's terrifying.
This was the early 2000s. Like, nobody wanted to buy a DNA testing kit, right? Now, now Blackstone just purchased 75% of Ancestry for, I think, $4.7 billion.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And only a few years ago, the entire company, 4 years ago, it was valued at $2.6 billion. So it went from $2.6 billion in 2016 to well over $5 billion now.
Yeah.
I mean, who could have, he never, Bennett Greenspan did not foresee this. Nobody did, I don't think.
Yeah, it's nuts. What advice would you have for genealogists who want to use their DNA to the most benefit? What would you tell people to do?
That's an interesting question. How do you mean that, for the most benefit? Like,
so if you want to, I guess if you're on the hunt into your own family history and you want to figure that out, we've got a question in the chat about GEDmatch, and is that what should a person do if they're just starting out getting their DNA? What route would you recommend that they take?
So I would say if you're looking for genetic relatives, you are playing a numbers game. And, you're going to find some people in one database and not in the other. And so some people will wind up testing in more than one, right? And I've tested in 3. It used to be that if you were an adoptee, you were looking for a second cousin match or closer, ideally. And so you would test in 3 databases back when there were only 3. And then when MyHeritage came on the scene, you'd test in 4. Because you'd get countless distant cousins and you'd be hoping for that one second cousin match. Now, the databases, particularly at Ancestry and 23andMe, which have 18 and 12 million respectively, are so large that an adopted person is much, much more likely to get a second cousin or closer match at either one of those. So if you're testing for a specific reason, like you're looking for a close match, but you're not a specific person, you may be able to just test in one and figure it out from there. But if you're kind of looking to, find out as many relatives as possible, you may wind up having to match relatives at more than one database. Sometimes you find those people are just in one,
Yeah, for sure. Another question people ask about from Mary Ryan: do DNA companies do a good job of determining Native American ancestry? Several people have thought they were Native American, myself included. I'd always heard that I had a little bit of Native American, and then when I got my results, 0.0.
That's why I had that example in the prologue of the book, right? That people test to find out, because that is an incredibly common experience. In fact, there's a researcher who's done a study at looking at this, and that it is common for Americans to kind of overestimate the amount of Native American heritage they'll have. That's almost like a meme in our culture.
Yeah.
And you see it over and over, and then people test and it's not there.
Yeah.
So, I could tell you specifically how they do with Native American ancestry. Like, I guess maybe the question behind your question is like, are they right? Or is it really there and they missed it? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, I suppose if it's many, many, many generations back, it could be hard to detect, although I'm not quite sure how many generations you'd have to go back for it to be tough to detect. But I think that the more likely scenario is that there are many families where stories of Native American ancestry were passed down for one reason or another, but it perhaps is not actually there.
Yeah. And I think that there's a romance to Native American heritage like that. And can you give me some good stories of people who have their family narrative that
Yeah.
collides with the DNA that they get and how they've
Yeah.
dealt with it?
I mean, that's actually one of the most important things that we're talking about here, right? Is this narrative of self and the narrative of family. And the reason I think this is an important topic to talk about is because I think that there are very essential human questions that we've always wrestled with. They're questions like, what makes me who I am, right? Nature
Yeah.
versus nurture, biology versus experience. Are you the ethnicity you were raised as? Or, I mean, do you identify? I identify really strongly with my mother's ethnicity and not with my father's. Not because I love them any differently from one another. It's just the way it is, right? So
Yeah.
we're always kind of selective in our interpretations, and we've always thought about this stuff. We've always struggled with this stuff. And one of the questions that I think really comes up a lot for people in the DNA age now is not only who am I, but who would I have been if I had known sooner that I'm not who I thought I was.
Yeah.
So there's a man named Rosario Castronovo, who I write about in the book, fascinating guy. And he discovered I think it was his early 50s, that the family narrative he had was all wrong. Now, this is a guy who was told he was Sicilian on his mother's side. His mother said, we're Sicilian.
Mhm.
And he was, I would say, a classic seeker, even before DNA. He was always looking to kind of identify more strongly with his roots, so much so that when he moved away from home and he changed his name, he changed it to Rosario Castronovo because it was an Italian name. And he identified really strongly with his Italian roots. His original name was something completely different.
Mm.
He studied opera, he converted to Catholicism, he proposed to his Italian American wife in Italy. Okay, this is a guy so steeped in his Italianness.
Yeah.
And he discovers through DNA testing that he is what percent Italian? 0.00% Italian. And that in fact, what he is 18% sub-Saharan African.
Yeah.
So his grandfather was a Black man, and his grandmother was white. This is on his mother's side. And they had a relationship. And ultimately, his Black grandfather was put in jail for this relationship. And his mother and her brother were put out to foster care, and they endured um, discrimination, racist, pejorative words directed at them. And she was growing up in the middle of the century. And when she grew up and she had her own child, she decided that her child was never going to experience the discrimination that she had experienced. So what did she tell her son? She said, we're Sicilian. And
Wow.
I found a number of stories like this. I was reporting the book. One child who was now an adult who was told she was Native American. Another woman who was told she was Italian also. And the common theme being in all of these situations that they were in fact part Black. And for various reasons, either because someone was trying to protect them or because there was actually kind of bias within the family itself that didn't want to admit the genetic ancestry of the child in the family. For various reasons, these children were denied their true heritage. And in Rosario's case, this is like a really profound thing. He's changed his orientation on the world. His perspective is totally altered. And he's come to see the history of this country and the history of Vermont, where his mom's from, very differently. And he's gone deep into research on the Black community in Vermont and how they fared and when they fled, which particular areas and how they were treated. And I would say for him and for the vast majority of people that I interviewed who found something profound and life-changing about their DNA, even when it was upsetting or really clashed with a narrative that they very much at one point wanted to believe in, they would almost always tell me, "I'm glad to know. I'm glad to know the truth. It's meaningful to know the truth, and it's clarifying and it's deepening, right?" And so this has made he now struggles with how to kind of what to call himself, how to carry himself, because he passes as white, doesn't know if he can call himself black. He talks about that in the book. It's really, really interesting. But I think he's a great example of someone who, the narrative was a fantasy. And the truth is the truth about the cruelties of history, but also the DNA gave him back something that was taken from his family.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think, to see how people cope with losing that identity and developing another one, and what that does for who you are.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, you mentioned that European Americans, there's such a larger database, and African Americans, there's not. And I think that played into, how law enforcement is also using DNA. And can you talk about the reactions there, and what it means? I mean, it's such a hot topic right now, given the state of our country and race relations. How is DNA fitting into all of that, and vice versa?
Yeah. So DNA is something that, this is genetic information that was originally taken for family history research purposes. And in the very beginning, when it was used to solve the Golden State Killer case and when he was arrested, there was a great kind of outcry from privacy experts, from genetic genealogists, some genetic genealogists, saying, this is a violation of the spirit of the Fourth Amendment. This is a violation of information that was taken for one purpose and is now being used for another. And since then, what's happened is that it's become, basically an opt-in, opt-out situation. So if your DNA is at one of the two databases that law enforcement has permission to access on some more or less limited basis, depending on the database, and those are GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, you're either opting into that or you're opting out, depending on how it works at that particular place. And so the question of the original intent of the genetic information is somewhat lessened. And I've seen polls. This is maybe a year or so ago. There's been a couple of polls of Americans' attitudes towards this use, and people seem to be pretty much fine with it, as long as it's being used for the most sort of atrocious cases. And for the most part, it is, because it's expensive. So law enforcement uses they're looking at cold cases and DNA that's been preserved since, say, the 1970s, and they're doing this for the homicide cases and the sexual assaults. At the same time, though, a number of people I know pulled their kits. They pulled their kits from GEDmatch. They opted out at Family Tree DNA of having law enforcement access, be permitted to access their information. And a number of those people who've done that have been folks within the African American community, because even though the databases are overwhelmingly white, which would seem to skew towards finding more white suspects, and may indeed do that, on a statistical level, there's always this concern that, even if the DNA evidence is reliable, we've seen in the past that police methods can be always misused, right? And there's always a kind of a concern that if for whatever reason this information isn't used in the right way, or it's applied only selectively, that it could further racial discrimination if there's bias in the system.
For sure, absolutely. So I'm going to go to our chat and kind of knock out some of these questions. My mother would like to know, in writing your book, what was the biggest aha moment?
That's a great question from your mom.
She's always got good questions. I've dealt with it for
Really
38.
makes me think, yeah.
Yeah.
Biggest aha moment. I don't know if I can say what the biggest aha moment is, but I'm going to tell you one moment that really stayed with me. There's a woman named Linda in the book. I should say the book has a central narrative, and it's a story of a woman named Alice, and it starts when she tests back in 2012, and it's basically an existential whodunit. It's like a genetic detective mystery. It's really compelling. It goes back 100 years, and it pushes you through the book. But in between, I'm telling a lot of stories from people who reached out to me or I found in my reporting, and one of the stories that I tell is Linda. And Linda was adopted, and she didn't know it until she took a DNA test. And in fact, she had just undergone a hysterectomy. As a result of medical concerns, she had some more symptoms, but some of it was her family health history and her understanding that she was half Ashkenazi Jewish. And she wasn't those things because she was adopted, right? So her family health history was all wrong because she didn't know she was adopted, and she was not half Ashkenazi Jewish because she was adopted. When she had actually gone to her mother to get her family health history in advance of the surgery, and her mother had not told her, which is like completely shocking.
Yeah.
So she finds out after the hysterectomy that she's actually adopted, that, you know, half the reason that she went into this surgery, you know, it wasn't warranted, right? And she might not have needed it at all. And she begins the process of reaching out to her maternal side and reaching out to her paternal side. And she reaches out to her father's side, and she talks to her dad a couple times, her biological dad. And eventually he tells her, listen, you know, you seem nice, but these calls are getting me in trouble with my wife. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So she kind of like backs off. She tries to forge some relationships with her siblings on her dad's side. And it's awkward because they don't want to go around their dad's back, or they think the whole thing is fishy or whatever. There are cases where people think that, you know, it's all a big scam. That's not true in her case, but I do write about others. You know, there's always a certain level of suspicion. And for Linda, it's really painful because, you know, she's basically forced to be the messenger of her own existence. And they always say, like, don't shoot the messenger, right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine that your own genetic identity is a secret from you? Then you walk into a situation where you're like, hey, I exist. And everyone's like, no, thank you. We don't like the fact that you're giving us bad news. And the bad news is you,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
absolutely crushing and so traumatic. And there's nobody to help her. There's no one to hold her hand. There's no mediator. It's not like in a situation where you get genetic testing in a doctor's office and there's like a genetic counselor that sits with you and helps you interpret the results. Or it's not like there's bioethical guidelines, like, you know, should we give them this information or shouldn't we? You know, the information is just there, and she's then got to deal with it. She's got to do the outreach, and she is like her home marketing and publicist, and she's everything. And it's really hard not to take it personally when somebody says, I don't want to know you. So she goes to her biological mother's side. Her mother, it turns out, has just passed away a few months before. And she reaches out to her daughter, her half sisters, her mother's daughters. And they're in grief, and they're like, what are you saying about our mother? She had a child before us. You know, go away, basically. And it leaves her with this really bereft sense of things. And I emailed and phoned with Linda over a very long time. I think she first emailed me in 2017. We talked in 2018. We talked in 2019 to see how she was doing. And by the end, when I was finishing up the book, I checked in with her again. And she was working as a search angel now, which is a search angel is someone who generally for free helps other people interpret their DNA results or helps them do DNA testing to find immediate kin. And she told me she was helping other people. And she said she tells people to keep their expectations low because she says, you never know what you're going to find. It's not in your control. Some people bite and some are open armed. And I thought, man, that is like the best quote. I put it at the end of the book because there's the fickleness of human nature, the notion that a I don't know, biological siblings could reject one another. But it does happen, and it happens for understandable reasons because they were never told, because it clashes with their personal narratives. I think Linda would tell you that she is glad to know the truth, but it has not been an uncomplicated truth. It hasn't for sure been a painless truth. It's been very, very bittersweet for her.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there was in my own experience when my cousin who had been adopted away contacted me, and initially there was some hesitance by some members of my family, and eventually it was, well, what does he want? You
Yes,
know,
that's always the question.
and it's like, I don't think he's trying to shake us down, you know, like that sort of thing. Another question from Rosemary Wall. My husband tried to test with 23andMe twice and could not get any results. Is this common?
I've never heard of that. And I wonder what it means to not get any results. Does that mean that he sent it in and they couldn't process the kit? Or does it mean there were no relatives in the database, which would be very surprising?
Yeah.
So maybe you could follow up on that.
Yeah. Follow up, Rosemary, if
Give
you've
us
got
more
it.
information.
Paula Carroll asks, many states are changing laws regarding access to original birth records for adoptees. This opens up records previously sealed and seems to indicate that a closed adoption, even from the record standpoint, is no longer possible. It seems the laws are always running behind the technology. Your book touches on that in various ways. For adoptees, it means info is available for those who are connected or contacted. It can be very unwelcome. What are your thoughts on how legislation should progress in the genetic area? What changes do you see coming?
Yeah, it's interesting because it definitely does seem to be something that is progressing, but progressing slowly. I know New York State recently opened up its records for adoptees. That happened within the last year. And at the same time that this is happening, adopted persons have been using DNA to get around the lack of access for 10 years. In fact, the methods that were used to catch the Golden State Killer were methods developed to help adoptees and others find their genetic families. And the woman who helped, the genetic genealogist who helped, was a volunteer with a group called DNA Adoption, right? So
Yeah.
it was not new. Those techniques in the Golden State Killer was just new in their application.
Right.
So it's interesting because somebody asked me, do you think that DNA is going to speed up the opening the records or slow it down? Because legislators will sort of decide that it's not necessary because DNA is allowing people to get around it. I don't have a crystal ball, but my guess would be that it would not slow it down. My guess would be that it would speed it up, because I think it's an issue that because it seems sort of inevitable that it's going to happen one way or the other for a person to be able to find their immediate family. I think it's very possible that legislators will say, well, it's going to happen anyway, so we're going to kind of make these things more available. And I think there's a growing movement towards this idea that accessing your own original birth certificate is a rights issue.
Yeah.
So that may be something that's happening eventually. Yeah.
Neanderthal genes. What's the significance of that when you get them in your DNA results?
Well, I have more than average, so I would say it means you're special. 23andMe gives you your Neanderthal results, and it tells you if you're above or below average. And I've actually heard really good PR on Neanderthals recently, like they're less violent, they're more gentle. That's I don't know what else to tell you.
They're making a comeback.
Yeah, it's making a comeback. I think they say that there's actually more Neanderthal DNA walking the earth now than there was during the time of the Neanderthals, I guess we should say, that's how you pronounce it.
It makes you feel like a Neanderthal to say it, Neanderthal.
Yeah. But that's because the population, because there's such a much bigger population on the earth, that tiny bit of DNA spread across all those people, if I have it right, means that there's more DNA, more Neanderthal DNA now than there was then. Pretty cool.
Follow up on Rosemary's question with no results. The first time they said it could not process, they sent another test kit and he redid the sample. Again, they replied that they were not able to get any DNA information.
I haven't heard a story like that, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened to somebody other than to your husband. That's very interesting. And I'm assuming he spit up to the line and he let the bubbles clear the line and all of that. I guess you could try another company, right? And you could try, some companies do the cheek swab, like MyHeritage does a cheek swab. You could try that, but hopefully you can get your money back first.
Mary Evans, full siblings can have different DNA results. Different things can show up in all of them. Also, Native American DNA does not have the DNA pools to draw from for matching up or showing ethnicity like European, etc. That was a follow-up from our conversation earlier, I guess. I tested with Ancestry about 6 years ago. It showed a small percentage of Asian, which made no sense. Recent updates to the Ancestry record now show a small percentage of Indigenous North American. That makes sense because my paternal grandfather was born in Cherokee Territory in Oklahoma, and I am a registered member of Cherokee Nation.
Yeah.
I tested with 23andMe looking for my Native American percentage and came up shocked with 30% European. I'm going to skip to some that are questions. A lot of comments, a lot of good comments here. Related side note, the Elizabeth Warren fiasco must be understood with the provision that genetic test results are not the basis for membership in any of the 3 Cherokee tribes.
Right. And that's really a political affiliation that the tribes have fought for. And it's very important to their status that that very specific political identity, their political status, which is tied to a very specific definition. And that's why you had such a sense, there was such an outcry from many Indigenous people that this was threatening to them. It's if you haven't covered the issue or followed the issue closely, it seems like why would her claim of Native Americanness be threatening to them? But it has to do with, you know, the way that they're defining their own identities, which is partly a matter of sort of definition of how you claim membership, but it's also as one Indigenous scholar explained it to me, you know, it's a question of like experience and community, and you know, define it's defining your Native Americanness through a network of relationships. And so for someone who doesn't have that experience to kind of come in, you know, it's kind of counter to how they define it for themselves. So that was happening as I was writing the book and I was reporting on it. I have a section on it. And it also, I have some material on this topic and this idea of like, again, this question of how much should science get to tell you about your own identity, your own sacred narratives. There is often this kind of clash, as we've been talking about, between what you believe about yourself or about your people, and what science wants to tell you about it through a DNA test. And you see a lot of that playing out right now in terms of people trying to reckon with that.
Sure. Libby, how do you think DNA results will affect movements like Black Lives Matter?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I can answer that quite as intelligently as I would like to, but
Yeah.
I will say this. 23andMe has been doing a lot of really interesting research looking at the history of America as told through the genes. And you can see, first of all, you can see a lot of people who identify as white all over the country, and especially so in the South, who have significant African ancestry that, according to the old one drop rule, would have made them be considered Black. And it really drives home, you know, how strangely we have come to kind of think and define race in this country for, you know, hundreds of years for historical reasons. They've also done research that looks at the history of the, you know, African American community, the genes of the African American community, and found, you know, a lot of European white genes, and typically the story that those white genes are telling are stories of white men having sex with Black women, and generally this is Black enslaved women, right, pre 1860. So that is a story that we all have to kind of reckon with, and we all have to kind of look at. And I really appreciate that 23andMe is doing this research right now, because
Yeah.
it's driving home stories that I think, you know, people don't know about, or they don't want to believe. And as people do their family history research, I think there's the possibility that we start to recognize the diversity in our family stories and the diversity within ourselves. So we start to see, oh, wow, my great great grandfather, you know, was actually a slave owner, or he was in, you know, the the cotton trade. And so we are all kind of, we can look at our own history in a more frank way.
Yeah.
And we can understand the cruelties of it, and we can understand the 360 of it, and maybe in a better way, because we're in a particular moment where a lot of people are really eagerly researching their histories. And
Yeah.
and I think the last thing I'll say about that is that, like, the past is not over.
Yeah.
You know, we tend to think of, you know, people 100 years ago as like very, very different from us and very, very distant. Like, they didn't even have cars, so what kind, how good could their lives possibly have been?
Yeah.
And yet the past shapes us. I mean, you ask any person who, you know, just discovered they're in their 60s, they just discovered they were donor conceived, right? And the past is not over. The past informs who we are. And we happen to be in a moment of great reckoning for the culture at large. It's happening across the culture, it's happening family by family, and it's happening for a lot of individual Americans, for millions of Americans.
Yeah. One more question from the chat. Big oil, big pharma, should we be afraid of big DNA?
That's a really good question. You know, I kind of explore a lot of this in the book, and you know, there's this sort of asymmetry, I think, in terms of how we donate our genetic material. We don't even donate it. We pay for the privilege of having it analyzed. And then the companies that, if we consent to research, which most people at a company like 23andMe do, they can make a lot of money off of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is a great asymmetry that maybe a lot of people don't kind of think about. And the other thing I think I'll say on the topic of big DNA is, and this is privacy writ large, but it's also privacy writ small. On a personal level, the amount of information that's out about you right now because of social media and what you put on Facebook and what you put on Twitter and what's available about you, like through people searches and things like that, is enormous. There's, you know, not that many people I know who don't have a digital trail of some kind. When that information is combined with a genetic relative match, you know, you can very easily find someone who is not in the database. So, you know, my decision to test has implications for a second cousin. If a second cousin conceived a child in high school and didn't know it, and I don't even know that second cousin, and his daughter is searching for him, my decision to test and be in the database, even though I don't even know my second cousin's name, is going to help that child find their father, which could be a good, bad, mixed blessing for both of them. Could be good for one, bad for the other, could be good for the child and good for the father and bad for that man's wife, because they, whatever, there's all sorts of ways you see it play out. But when you think about the question of privacy and big DNA, so to speak, it's not just the spitting into a tube and the information going to a database. It's then that information combined with everything we have available online, which means that, you know, 35 million people in the databases means that virtually every American is now implicated by this technology, whether or not they choose to test. And so we all need to start thinking about the fact that family secrets are over, and the kind of legacy of that in terms of how we have certain difficult conversations, particularly if we're parents with our children. Yeah. Because these secrets are going to come out. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And, you know, the numbers in the databases are only going up. For sure.
Well, thank you, Libby. If people are Libby Copeland fans, what can they expect from you next? Are you going to write another DNA book?
I don't know what I'm doing next. Right now, I'm hanging on by a string while my kids are in school-ish.
Yeah, for sure.
So.
Can we follow you on social media? Where are you?
Yeah. So yeah, I have a website. It's libbycopeland.com. I have Twitter, it's Libby Copeland. Pretty easy to find. And yeah, and if you want, I'm signing books. So you know, if you order a book from wherever, that's fine, or get it from your library, and you know, that's great. And if you want an independent bookstore, if you want to support an independent bookstore, there's a website called bookshop.org that's different than Amazon because you're supporting independent bookstores. And then there's one, I think, in the chat, the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. If you call them, I can sign a book and make it out to people. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
That information is there in the chat. So call there and attention Jennifer Cohn and ask for a signed Libby Copeland book. Thank you to the Central Arkansas Library System. The Roberts Library put this on. Thanks to all of you guys for tuning in. If you want to follow me at argentareadingseries.com. I'd love to have you when we're back up and running. Libby, thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you for writing the book and doing the work.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so pleased that everyone got to join me. This is a wonderful group. So thank you for all the really awesome, interesting questions.
Awesome. Good night, y'all. Thanks for tuning in.
Good night.